I watched Connie Kavanaugh's hands first, not her face. 7 years of Child Protective Services taught me that faces lie, but hands don't. And Connie's hands, the same hands that brought uninvited casseroles and squeezed my children a little too long at drop-off, were gripping the edge of the table in Judge Moreland's chambers so hard her fingertips had gone white. Grace Yoon Pfeiffer, my attorney, had just placed a single document on the table. 1 page. That's all it took. 1 page with a phrase on it that a devoted grandmother would never have known, unless she'd done her homework. And Connie had done her homework. She just didn't realize I'd been grading papers like hers for 900 families. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're new here, hit subscribe and the bell. You're going to want to hear how this one ends. My name is Wren Elliott Kavanaugh. I'm 32, I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and for 7 years I worked as a Child Protective Services investigator for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, which is a very official way of saying I knocked on strangers' doors and tried to figure out if their kids were safe before my lunch break. 900 investigations, 900 front doors with 900 different smells behind them. I could walk into a house and tell you within 15 minutes whether a child was in danger or whether somebody was weaponizing the system, because I'd seen both, hundreds of times, and the difference lives in details that civilians never think to look for. A real neglect home has patterns: empty fridges with full liquor shelves, children who flinch at sudden movements but not at yelling because they've stopped flinching at yelling, bedrooms with locks on the outside, crayon drawings that are always dark, always small, always in the corner of the page. You learn to read a house the way a detective reads a crime scene, except the evidence is alive and looking at you, and sometimes asking if you want juice. A weaponized report has different patterns entirely. The complaint is too specific. The language is too clinical. The concerned party knows details about the family's schedule that only someone close would know. And the allegations escalate in a rhythm that matches court filing deadlines rather than actual incidents. That one took me 4 years to learn. It's going to save my children in about 45 minutes. I left DCS 2 years ago, took a job as a family advocate at a nonprofit. Lower pay, less burnout, still helping kids. I didn't leave because I stopped being good at it. I left because I was too good at it, and it was eating me alive. There's a difference between someone who burns out from incompetence and someone who burns out from absorbing too much competence into their nervous system. Most people don't ask which one I was. My grandmother understood it without me explaining. Grandma Della Elliott, 74 years old, still alive, still sharp, still living in Maryville in the same house with the same wind chimes that once got a neighbor to file a noise complaint. Della retired after 31 years as a Knox County family court clerk. She processed every custody filing, every protective order, every guardianship petition that walked through the courthouse doors for 3 decades. She knows the family court system the way a mechanic knows an engine, not from studying it, but from handling every piece of it with her hands until the grease was permanent. Della taught me 2 things that became my operating system. Money. Keep a bank account your husband doesn't manage, not because he's bad, because you should never have to ask for what's yours. She opened a credit union account in my name on my 18th birthday and added $50 every Christmas for 14 years. I started adding to it myself once I got hired at DCS. That account sat in Maryville like a fire extinguisher behind glass. You hope you never need it, but when the kitchen catches fire, you don't want to be standing there Googling how to put out grease fire. People. When someone files a complaint about you, read the complaint before you read the person. The paperwork tells you what they want. The person just tells you what they want you to believe. She said that after the neighbor with the wind chimes. Della went to the courthouse, pulled the complaint, and found the man had filed 7 complaints against 7 different neighbors in 14 months. She came home and told me, "That's not a noise problem. That's a person problem wearing a legal costume." I carry her courthouse keychain on my car keys. Brass key fob, stamped Knox County Clerk of Court. She gave it to me the day I got hired at DCS. "You're going to walk into a lot of houses that feel wrong," she said. "Carry this so you remember what the system looks like when it works right." I've wrapped my hand around it before every difficult conversation for 9 years. I didn't know the most difficult conversation would be about my own house. Before I tell you what happened, let me tell you what my life looked like when it was still mine. 2 kids, Nora, 6, and Emmett, 4. A house in Knoxville with a yard big enough for a swing set, and small enough that I could see both of them from the kitchen window. A husband named Kyle who worked logistics for a trucking company and was not, I want to be very clear, the problem in this story. Kyle Kavanaugh had the profound misfortune of being born to a woman who believed loving her son meant owning his household. He was a decent man married to a complicated situation, and I say that with precision because precision is about to matter quite a bit. I met Connie Kavanaugh for the first time at a Sunday dinner 3 months into dating Kyle. She hugged me at the door, held my face in both hands, and said, "Finally, someone who can keep up with my boy." I thought it was warmth. Looking back, it was an audition. She was casting the role of daughter-in-law, and the part came with stage directions she hadn't shared yet. Connie was 61, retired dental office receptionist, widowed 3 years ago when Kyle's father had a heart attack mowing the lawn on a Tuesday. Before Frank died, Connie was manageable, the kind of mother-in-law who had opinions about your curtains and expressed them through compliments about other people's curtains. Passive-aggressive, sure, but within the range of normal. The kind of woman you learn to translate. "Those curtains are so brave," means, "I hate your curtains." You adjust. After Frank died, the translation got harder. Grief does different things to different people. I learned that at DCS. I walked into houses where grief had turned parents into ghosts, and houses where grief had turned parents into walls. Some people, grief softens. Connie, it sharpened. The woman who'd been passively annoying became actively strategic, and the strategy was access. On the surface, Connie was the devoted grandmother. Photos of my kids in her wallet. Casseroles that showed up without invitation, but also without warning, which meant I'd open the front door, and there she'd be, Pyrex in hand, smiling like a woman who just happened to be in the neighborhood despite living 40 minutes away. She called the kids every night to say goodnight. Bedtime was 7:30. Connie called at 8:45 because, and I quote, "my schedule." Apparently, her schedule was governed by a clock in a different time zone, possibly emotional. She'd never accepted that her son married a woman who worked in child protective services. She considered it low class, depressing, and once told her sister Patrice it was not a career, it's a government paycheck with a sad commute. She'd also never forgiven me for moving the family 40 minutes from Maryville to Knoxville, which reduced her access from daily drop-ins to scheduled visits. Let me be precise about that, because precision matters in this story. Before we moved, Connie had a key to our apartment. She came by 3 to 4 times a week. She rearranged my kitchen once while I was at work and told me she was helping. She reorganized Emmett's dresser drawers by color. He was 2. He did not have a color-coded wardrobe situation. He had onesies. After we moved, Connie had to call ahead. She visited on Saturdays. She had to be invited for weekday dinners. And she hated it, with the kind of controlled fury that looks like sweetness until you're close enough to see the jaw. The red flags were there, and I dismissed every one of them, because she was my children's grandmother, and I'd been trained to look for red flags in strangers, not in family. She once told Emmett in front of me that Grandma's house is where the fun is. I laughed it off. She corrected Nora's grammar at the dinner table and then said, "Your mother should be teaching you that." I let it go. She called Kyle 4 times in 1 week to suggest the kids might be happier spending weekdays in Maryville so they could attend better schools, her word, and Kyle told her no, and she cried, and he apologized, and I stood in the kitchen thinking, this feels like a pattern I've documented in other people's case files. She once showed up at Nora's school unannounced to have lunch with her granddaughter, and was surprised to learn that wasn't how school visitor policies worked. She told the office secretary she was practically a co-parent. The secretary called me. I said she wasn't. Connie called Kyle to tell him I'd embarrassed her at the school. Kyle called me. I said she'd embarrassed herself. We never discussed it again, which, in retrospect, was a mistake. Because things you don't discuss don't go away. They just find paperwork. There was also the Christmas incident. Connie bought Nora a phone, a real phone, not a toy, without asking us. Nora was 5. Connie said it was so they could talk whenever Nora wants to, without asking permission. I returned the phone. Connie told Kyle I was controlling her relationship with the grandchildren. Kyle told Connie that 5-year-olds don't need phones. Connie cried. Kyle apologized. The cycle repeated itself with such consistency that I started thinking of it as a feedback loop. Connie overstepped, got corrected, performed victimhood, extracted an apology, and reset the clock. It was remarkably efficient. If she'd applied that project management skill to literally anything else, she'd have run a Fortune 500 company. And then there was the incident I should have treated as a red flag, but instead treated as Connie being Connie. She found my DCS training manual in the guest room closet. I kept old work materials in a box I hadn't unpacked since we moved, and I caught her reading it at the kitchen table during a Saturday visit. She closed it quickly and said, "Just curious about what you used to do." I took it back and didn't think about it again. I should have, because that training manual contains the structured decision-making tool, and someone, 5 months later, was going to quote it word for word on an anonymous hotline call. Here's who helped her find that paperwork. Patrice Morley, Connie's younger sister, 57, licensed practical nurse at an urgent care clinic. Patrice had the medical vocabulary, and Connie had the motive, and together, they were about to build something that could have taken my children from me. Patrice had been documenting observations about the children during visits to Connie's house. Scratches, called bruises. A normal childhood rash, called a sign of neglect. Emmett's weight, perfectly healthy, consistently 30th percentile since birth, described as concerning. And a missed lunch, described as chronic food insecurity. She wrote these observations in a little spiral notebook, in clinical language, like she was charting at the urgent care clinic. Except her patients at the urgent care were walk-in adults with sore throats, and these patients were my children, eating cookies at Grandma's house while their aunt scribbled diagnoses in the other room. In my 7 years at DCS, I learned that the system works when good people use it honestly, and breaks when desperate people use it as a weapon. I investigated 900 homes. I removed children who needed removing. I closed cases that needed closing, and I always knew the difference between a family in trouble and a family being targeted. I just never thought I'd be sitting on this side of the intake form. The first complaint came in January. I didn't find out about it the way most parents do. No knock on the door, no official call from a caseworker. I found out because I still had professional contacts at DCS, and one of them called me on a Tuesday morning in the careful tone of a colleague who doesn't want to alarm you, but absolutely is alarming you. "Ren, there's an intake on your address." Anonymous tip. The children were allegedly left unsupervised in the yard while the mother was inside. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding my phone with both hands, and thinking, I know what this is. I've read 1,000 of these. This is the opening move. Because here's what civilians don't understand about CPS complaints. The first one is almost always mild, general, designed to create a file. It's the complaint that opens the door, so the next one has somewhere to walk through. At DCS, we called them foundation reports. They don't substantiate on their own. They exist so that when the second one arrives, there's already a case number. The investigator came. He was young, new to the field, professional. He walked through my house the way I'd walked through 900 others, checking the fridge, checking the bedrooms, looking at the kids. Nora showed him her drawings. Emmett offered him a yogurt cup. The investigator documented a clean, safe, adequately stocked home with 2 healthy, social children, and a mother who happened to know more about his assessment criteria than he did. The case was closed as unsubstantiated. I should have felt relieved. I felt watched. The second complaint came in March, 8 weeks later. The children appear underweight and poorly groomed, with visible marks on their arms. Emmett is in the 30th percentile for weight. He has been since birth. His pediatrician has charted it consistently at every single well-child visit for 4 years. That's not underweight. That's his body. Nora had a scratch on her forearm from climbing the fence at her friend's house. I had photographed it the day it happened and texted the photo to her friend's mother because that's what you do when your 6-year-old comes home looking like she lost a fight with a rose bush. A second investigator came, different from the first. She was thorough. She asked more questions. She looked at the scratch on Nora's arm, and I showed her the text message thread. Photo, timestamp, conversation with the friend's mother. She documented it, closed the case, unsubstantiated. But I was starting to count the rhythm. January, March. Each complaint filed anonymously, each one slightly more serious, each one using language that was polished in a way that worried me, not because of what it said, but because of how it said it. Then May, the third complaint. This one alleged that the mother, me, frequently appears impaired during school drop-off, and the home smells of substances. I don't drink during the week. I don't drink much on weekends. I have never used a recreational drug in my life. I drink coffee like it owes me money, and I take an antihistamine in the spring because East Tennessee pollen count is essentially a biohazard warning. But impaired? Substances? The complaint used a phrase, signs consistent with substance-impaired caregiving. I read that phrase and my hands went still, because that phrase is not something a concerned neighbor says. A concerned neighbor says, I think she's on something. A concerned neighbor says, she seemed out of it at pickup. What a concerned neighbor does not say is signs consistent with substance-impaired caregiving, because that phrase comes from the DCS structured decision-making tool, the standardized assessment instrument I used for 900 investigations. It's clinical language from an internal document. It's the language of the system itself. You'd have to study the system's own vocabulary to write that sentence. Someone didn't just call the hotline. Someone did homework. And they made one mistake. They studied too hard. I picked up my kids from school that afternoon and drove to Connie's house for the scheduled Tuesday visit. I was 20 minutes early. The front door was open. The screen door was closed. And I heard Connie on the phone with Patrice, voice carrying the way it does in old houses with thin walls and no shame. She spent 7 years taking other people's children away. That's all she knows how to do, break families apart. Now she gets to see how it feels when someone uses the system on her. She thinks because she used to work there, she's untouchable. She's not. She's just another name on a form, and forms don't care who filled them out. I stood on that porch with my hand wrapped around Della's keychain so tight the brass left a mark on my palm. I did not knock. I did not cry. I did not open that screen door and say a single word. I turned around, put the kids back in the car, told Nora we were going to get ice cream instead, because sometimes you need to let your children see you choose joy, even when you're holding a grenade pin in your pocket. And I drove to Joss's house. Grandma Della's voice was in my head the whole drive. Read the complaint before you read the person. The paperwork tells you what they want. I'd been reading Connie for 2 years. I should have been reading the complaints. Joss Adiemi opened her front door in surgical scrubs and a ponytail that suggested she'd been home for roughly 90 seconds. She looked at my face, moved aside, and said, "Wine or information?" "Both. Information first." Joss is my best friend, my college roommate from UT Knoxville, and a pediatric occupational therapist who works with children every single day. She evaluates developmental milestones in her sleep, which is not a metaphor. She once diagnosed a proprioceptive deficit while half awake at a barbecue because a kid was holding his fork wrong. She described Connie once as a woman who hugs you while she counts your silverware, which remains the most accurate clinical assessment I've ever heard from someone who is, technically, a licensed clinician. I told her everything. The 3 complaints, the escalating language, the SDM phrase, what I'd overheard on the porch. Joss sat on her kitchen counter. She has never once used a chair in her own home if a counter was available, and listened, without interrupting, until I was done. Then she said, "The fact that anyone believes you did this tells me everything about them and nothing about you." She paused. Also, substance-impaired caregiving? Connie can barely pronounce casserole correctly. Someone handed her that language like a loaded gun. "Patrice," I said, "the LPN sister who once told me that occupational therapy was just playing with kids?" "That's her." "Ren." Joss looked at me the way she looks at a parent who's just described symptoms she's heard 100 times. "This isn't going to stop. This is a campaign. You need a lawyer, and you need a file." She was right. And I knew she was right because I'd given that exact same speech to families sitting on the other side of the clipboard for 7 years. That night, I sat in my car in my own driveway for 10 minutes, wrapped my hand around Della's keychain. Not for courage, for clarity. I wasn't going to beg anyone to believe me. I wasn't going to scream at Connie. I was going to do what I'd spent 7 years training families to do when someone weaponized the system against them. Document everything, hire representation, and let the evidence be louder than the accusation. The next morning, I called Grace Yun Pfeiffer, family law attorney, former public defender, 8 years representing parents accused of neglect and abuse. She knows the DCS system from the defense side. I know it from the inside. Between us, we had the same system covered from both ends. Retainer was $3,500. I paid it from Della's credit union account, the one she opened on my 18th birthday, the one she told me to never put Kyle's name on. Not because Kyle is bad, because fire extinguishers shouldn't require a cosigner. Grace's office was small, organized, and smelled like printer toner and determination. She read all 3 complaints in front of me, didn't speak for 6 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "The language in the 3rd one is a problem. For them." I know. You recognize it? It's from the SDM tool, the Structured Decision-Making Instrument. DCS uses it in every investigation. A civilian wouldn't know that phrase. Grace made a note. So either someone who works at DCS filed this, or someone studied the assessment criteria to make the complaint sound institutional. Connie's sister is a licensed practical nurse. She has access to clinical terminology. She's been documenting observations about my kids during visits, calling playground scratches bruises, calling a normal weight percentile a sign of food insecurity. Grace put down her pen. How do you know that? Because I overheard Connie on the phone admitting it. And because I spent 7 years reading complaints exactly like these. And this one, I tapped the file, reads like someone who knows my schedule, my kids' school, and the specific language that makes a CPS investigator take a call seriously. That's not a stranger. That's someone in the house. Okay, Grace said. We build the file. And so we did. I started with what I already had. Here's the thing about being a woman who spent 7 years documenting other people's homes. I documented my own by habit, the way a dentist flosses without thinking about it. I photographed the fridge contents weekly for meal planning and posted them to a family group chat. I had 12 months of dated fridge photos showing fresh vegetables, labeled containers, milk that wasn't expired, and Emmett's name written on his yogurt cups in Sharpie because the child is 4 and territorial about dairy. Those photos had timestamps, every single one. The children's pediatrician records showed consistent healthy growth on the exact same percentile curves since birth. Emmett at the 30th percentile for weight, where he has been since his 6-month checkup. Nora at the 55th. Neither child had ever been flagged for nutritional concerns by their doctor, not once in 6 years, not at a single well-child visit. I had the growth charts printed and highlighted, because if you want to tell a judge my child is underweight, you're going to have to argue with a pediatrician's data first. School attendance records, 0 unexplained absences. Both children's teacher had submitted mid-year assessments noting, and I'm quoting the assessment form here, socially engaged, well-nourished, developmentally on track, and enthusiastic classroom participants. Nora's teacher wrote in the margin, a joy to have in class. Emmett's pre-K teacher wrote, Emmett brings the best snacks and shares without being asked, which frankly is a higher compliment than anything on my own performance reviews, and I had commendations. Speaking of which, I pulled my DCS personnel file. 7 years of performance reviews, peer assessments, a supervisor's letter saying, Wren Kavanaugh consistently demonstrates professional judgment, empathy, and thoroughness in her investigations. The idea that a woman with this record would neglect her own children was not just false, it was structurally absurd, like accusing a firefighter of arson because you don't like how she parks. Joss came through next. As a pediatric occupational therapist and mandated reporter, her clinical evaluations carry real weight with CPS investigators. Because mandated reporters don't sign their name to documents lightly, their license depends on accuracy. Joss assessed both kids formally, on the record, using the same standardized tools she uses at her clinic. Both children scored within normal developmental ranges across every domain: fine motor, gross motor, social emotional, adaptive behavior. No signs of neglect. No indicators of food insecurity. No behavioral markers associated with substance-impaired caregiving environments or chronic supervision failure. She wrote it up, signed it, dated it, and said, "If anyone wants to question my professional assessment, they can review my 9 years of clinical practice and then sit down." I also pulled my DCS training manual and cross-referenced each complaint against the exact criteria DCS uses to substantiate allegations. Point by point, line by line, I demonstrated that nothing in my home met the threshold for any of the 3 complaint categories. Unsupervised children? The yard is fenced, visible from the kitchen window, and the children were outside for 45 minutes between pickup and snack, which is called playing. Underweight? Documented at the same healthy percentile for 4 consecutive years. Substance impairment? 0 evidence, 0 witnesses, 0 history. The complaint didn't just fail to meet the threshold, it failed to approach it. It was a complaint written by someone who knew the vocabulary, but not the math. Meanwhile, I had to keep living my life as if it wasn't a case file. That was the strangest part. I drove Nora to soccer practice on Saturdays, knowing that somewhere in a DCS database, there was a file with my address that said my children were at risk. I went to parent-teacher conferences and smiled at the front office staff and wondered if they'd been contacted. I dropped Emmett off at pre-K every morning and made sure my hair was brushed, my clothes were clean, my car was organized, not because I'm vain, but because I knew that every public appearance was now an exhibit in a case I hadn't filed. I once spent 10 minutes in my driveway, lint rolling my jacket before school drop-off. Not because of lint, because I'd spent 7 years noting what parents looked like at school drop-off, and now I was performing stable mother for an audience that didn't know they were watching. That's where the comedy lives, I guess, in the gap between what you're doing and what you look like while you're doing it. I looked like a normal mom running errands. I was a former CPS investigator building a defense dossier in the Notes app on my phone between stops at the grocery store and the post office. I smiled at Connie during the one supervised visit we had during this period. She said, "The kids look good." I said, "They always do." She didn't hear the second sentence underneath the first one, which was, "And I have documentation to prove it, Connie, so keep smiling." But the evidence was only half the file. The other half was the timeline. I pulled every complaint and mapped the filing dates against Connie's grandparent visitation petition, which was pending in Knox County Family Court. Under Tennessee law, grandparents can petition for expanded visitation if they can demonstrate the child's home environment is unstable or the parent is unfit. January complaint, filed 4 days before the first mediation hearing. March complaint, filed 6 days before the second mediation session. May complaint, filed the week Connie's attorney submitted a motion for expanded visitation. 3 complaints, 3 court dates. I've been trained to identify patterns in case filing behavior. At DCS, we called this litigation-timed reporting, when complaints correlate with legal proceedings rather than actual incidents. It was one of the first indicators I learned to flag as a new investigator. And here it was, mapped onto my own life like a textbook exercise. Connie didn't want to take my children permanently. She wanted 3 substantiated CPS complaints. 3 substantiated complaints would give her attorney grounds to argue I was an unfit mother and request court-ordered visitation expanding to partial custody. Weekly overnights, holiday access, veto power over the children's schooling and medical decisions. She wasn't trying to rescue Nora and Emmett. She was trying to own the terms. The CPS complaints weren't about protecting my children. They were exhibits in a custody filing. I told Joss that on the phone, and she went quiet for 3 seconds, which is the longest Joss has ever been quiet about anything, and then said, "So your mother-in-law is treating the Department of Children's Services like Yelp for grandparents." That's exactly what she's doing. Wren, burn her. I'm not burning anyone. I'm building a file. Build it faster. She spent 7 years taking other people's children away. That's what Connie said about me. I kept hearing it while I organized documents at my kitchen table. She was right about one thing. I did spend 7 years in the system, but I didn't spend it taking children away. I spent it learning every seam, every process, every way the system can be used and misused. And I was going to use all of it. I want to pause here and tell you something about what this felt like, because the timeline and the evidence make it sound clinical and controlled. It wasn't. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. I spent 7 years being the person who shows up at your door with a clipboard and the authority to assess your parenting. I know what that knock sounds like. I know what that fear feels like for the families on the other side. And now I'm the one waiting for the knock, checking my fridge to make sure it's full enough, cleaning my house like evidence instead of like home. At what point does knowing exactly how the system works stop being an advantage and start being its own kind of torture? Because you know precisely how bad this can get. But I kept building. Grace filed a motion to compel disclosure of the anonymous complainant's identity, arguing a pattern of coordinated filings timed to custody proceedings. We also filed a formal response to the visitation petition with our counter-documentation attached. Every fridge photo, every pediatric record, every teacher assessment, Joss's clinical evaluation. The file was 4 inches thick. Grace said it was the most documented defense she'd ever filed for a family with no prior CPS history. I told her I couldn't help it. Documenting homes is what I do. She said, for once, that's working in your favor. And then David Okafor entered the picture. David was my supervisor at DCS for 3 years. He trained me. He's the one who taught me to read a complaint like a mechanic reads a diagnostic. Not what it says, but what it's built from. He'd been to my house for a department barbecue. He knew my children's names and their personalities, and the fact that Emmett would offer you food before he'd offer you a greeting, which David once called the most Tennessee thing about your household. When the 3rd complaint landed at Knox County DCS, David doesn't investigate cases involving former employees, but he sees intake reports. He recognized the pattern before I even called him. He called me. Ren, someone is using the system against you, and they're doing it badly. The language in Report 3 is from our own SDM tool. That's not a concerned neighbor. That's homework. David connected me with the DCS ombudsman and provided a professional reference letter confirming my exemplary service record and his personal knowledge of the family. But David also told me something I wasn't ready to hear. He said, I pulled the intake metadata on all 3 complaints. The call duration on the 3rd one is 14 minutes. Ren, a genuine anonymous tip averages 3 to 5 minutes. Someone sat on that phone for 14 minutes, reading from prepared notes. 14 minutes. That's not a phone call. That's a presentation. I went back to the complaints that night, laid all 3 on my kitchen table like case files, which is what they were, except the subject was my own address. And I saw what I should have caught earlier, if I hadn't been too close to the intake. The first complaint mentioned the children playing in the yard between 3:15 and 4 p.m. on weekdays. That's the exact window between school pickup and when I bring them inside for a snack. Only someone who had observed our daily schedule, or been told our schedule by someone who watched us, would know that specific 45-minute window. The second complaint described the children as underweight and referenced visible marks on their arms. Patrice's handwritten notes from the kids' visits to Connie's house used the same phrasing. She documented playground scratches as bruises, Emmett's 30th percentile weight as food insecurity, and the fact that Emmett cried when leaving Connie's house as distress at returning to the mother's home. Emmett cries when he leaves anywhere with cookies. He cries when we leave the grocery store. The child is 4 and has priorities that are entirely snack-based. And there was another contributor I hadn't known about. Connie had recruited a neighbor, Linda Fry, 48, lived 3 houses down on our street. Connie had told Linda that I had a history of instability and asked her to keep an eye on the kids when they're outside. Linda, believing she was genuinely helping protect children, had been noting times she saw Nora and Emmett in the yard and reporting those times back to Connie. Connie folded Linda's notes into the complaint file as documented unsupervised outdoor time. She gave the complaints a second source so they wouldn't all trace back to one voice. Linda wasn't malicious. Linda was used. And I felt something I hadn't expected when I figured that out. I felt sorry for her. Because I knew, from 900 investigations, exactly what it looks like when a decent person gets pulled into someone else's scheme without understanding the architecture. Linda saw a grandmother who seemed worried. She didn't see a grandmother who was building exhibits. I went to Grace with the full picture. The SDM language, the call duration, the schedule-specific details, the neighbor surveillance, Patrice's notes, and the correlation between filing dates and court dates. Grace laid everything out on her conference table and stood back from it the way you stand back from a puzzle when you found the last piece. This isn't a custody petition supported by CPS complaints, she said. This is a CPS campaign designed to manufacture a custody petition. The complaints aren't evidence. They're the strategy. I know, I said. I've seen it before, just never from inside. How do you want to handle it? I want to walk into that hearing with a file thick enough that Connie's attorney starts sweating before we open it. Grace smiled. It was the smile of an attorney who'd been handed a clean case. That I can do. Then I found the worst part. Grace obtained full discovery on Connie's visitation petition, and in Connie's own attorney's case notes, the internal strategy notes that the attorney had written after intake meetings with his client, there was a line. Client has been advised to document pattern of instability through appropriate channels prior to filing expanded petition. Prior to filing. Prior to filing. The CPS complaints weren't a reaction to something she saw. They weren't the result of genuine concern that escalated. They were a legal strategy, developed before the first complaint, planned with counsel, executed on a timeline. The complaints were the strategy. The hotline was the weapon, and my children were the leverage. Connie didn't just weaponize the system. She blueprinted the weapon before she built it. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with those documents spread in front of me. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep. And I understood, for the first time in this whole process, that my children's grandmother had looked at the system designed to protect children from abuse and decided, with legal advice, to use it to control their mother. I reached into my purse, found Della's keychain, held it. The brass was warm from being in my bag all day. Della's voice. The paperwork tells you what they want. The paperwork told me everything. Judge Moreland's chambers, Knox County Family Court. A rectangular table, dark wood, polished to the kind of shine that suggests someone takes this room seriously even when it's empty. 6 chairs, no audience, no gallery. Just the people who mattered. Present. Me. Grace Yun Pfeiffer. Connie Kavanaugh. Connie's attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who wore a blue tie that was working harder than he was. A guardian ad litem named Diane Foster, appointed by the court to represent Nora and Emmett's interests. And David Okafor's written declaration, 4 pages, notarized, sitting in Grace's folder. 6 people, 1 table. 1 stack of CPS complaints that someone had studied too carefully. Connie walked in looking like a grandmother from a greeting card. Soft cardigan, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She smiled at me, the smile that says, I'm the reasonable one here, and isn't this whole thing just so unfortunate? And sat down with her hands folded on the table like a woman posing for a church directory photo. Gerald opened. He was calm, practiced. He described a concerned grandmother who had witnessed troubling signs in her grandchildren's care. He referenced the 3 CPS complaints. He used the word concerning 4 times in 2 minutes, which I counted because counting tells you things. At DCS, 4 uses of concerning without a single specific incident means I don't have evidence, but I have adjectives. He asked the court to consider expanded visitation with an eye toward partial custody, given the documented concerns about the mother's fitness. Judge Moreland listened, nodded, turned to Grace. Grace didn't rush. She opened her folder the way I used to open case files, 1 document at a time, each one placed on the table facing the judge. Not a stack, a sequence. Because evidence isn't just about what you show. It's about the order you show it in. I taught her that. She taught me that's also how you try a case. Your Honor, my client is a former DCS investigator with 7 years of exemplary service and over 900 completed investigations. She left the department voluntarily to work as a family advocate. She has never been the subject of a substantiated complaint in her professional or personal life until her mother-in-law filed for expanded grandparent visitation. She placed the first document. This is a timeline. 3 anonymous CPS complaints filed in January, March, and May, each escalating in severity. Each filed within 1 week of a scheduled hearing or filing in Mrs. Kavanaugh's visitation petition. Second document. Pediatric records for both children. Consistent, healthy growth on the same percentile curves since birth. Emmett Kavanaugh has been in the 30th percentile for weight since his 6-month checkup. His pediatrician has never flagged a nutritional concern. Not once. Third document. School records. 0 unexplained absences. Mid-year teacher assessments noting both children as socially engaged, well-nourished, and developmentally on track. Fourth document. A formal clinical evaluation by Joss Adiemi, a licensed pediatric occupational therapist and mandated reporter, documenting that both children show 0 indicators of neglect, food insecurity, or supervision failure across every assessed developmental domain. Fifth document. Ms. Kavanaugh's 7-year DCS performance file, commendations, peer assessments, a supervisor reference letter, and a written declaration from David Okafor, senior CPS investigator and my client's former supervisor, confirming her professional record and his personal knowledge of the family's home environment. Connie was still smiling, but her hands had moved from the folded position to the edge of the table, fingers pressing into wood. Grace placed the 6th document, 1 page. Your Honor, the 3rd CPS complaint uses the phrase, signs consistent with substance-impaired caregiving. This is not civilian language. This phrase is drawn from the DCS Structured Decision-Making Tool, a standardized internal assessment instrument used by trained investigators. My client recognized it immediately because she administered that exact instrument for 900 investigations. An anonymous concerned neighbor would not use that phrase. Someone studied the system's own assessment criteria to make this complaint appear credible and institutional. She placed the 7th document, the attorney's case notes, the line circled in yellow highlighter. Client has been advised to document pattern of instability through appropriate channels prior to filing expanded petition. Prior to filing. Grace's voice didn't change pitch. It didn't need to. These complaints were not filed in response to observed concern about the children. They were manufactured as supporting exhibits for this proceeding. And the clinical language in Complaint 3 came from someone with medical training who studied the DCS assessment criteria to mimic institutional terminology. Someone like a licensed practical nurse. Someone like the petitioner's sister, Patrice Morley, who has been producing fabricated medical observations during the children's visits. She documented normal playground scratches as bruises, a healthy 30th percentile weight as food insecurity, a 4-year-old crying at the end of a visit as distress at returning to the mother's home. Grace looked at Connie. Your client told her sister, and my client overheard, that Ms. Kavanaugh spent 7 years taking other people's children away, and that she's just another name on a form, and forms don't care who filled them out. Your client was wrong. Investigators care. This court cares. And the forms tell us everything. The room was very quiet. Gerald tried. He straightened his tie, which did not help. Your Honor, my client's concern for her grandchildren is genuine. She has been a devoted grandmother. Your Honor, Grace did not raise her voice. Mr. Okafor's written declaration independently identifies the same pattern. Escalating anonymous complaints timed to court filings, clinical language from the DCS assessment toolkit, and allegations that are contradicted by documented medical and educational records. He describes this as, quote, a textbook case of system misuse. Additionally, the 3rd complaint's call duration was 14 minutes, nearly 3 times the average for genuine anonymous tips. That call was not spontaneous concern. It was a prepared script, read from notes, using language borrowed from an internal assessment tool that someone either studied or was coached on. Gerald looked at Connie. Then he looked at the table. Then he wrote something on his legal pad in handwriting so fast and pressured that I could tell from across the table it wasn't something optimistic. It was the handwriting of an attorney recalculating his case in real time. Connie's jaw tightened. I had every right to be concerned about my grandchildren. I'm their grandmother. I saw things that worried me. Grace didn't flinch. What specifically did you observe, Mrs. Kavanaugh, that isn't contradicted by the pediatric records, the school assessments, the clinical evaluation, and the DCS investigative findings, all of which found 0 evidence of neglect? Connie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Patrice said she noticed things. She's a nurse. She sees things. Patrice Morley documented normal playground scratches as bruises, and a child in the 30th weight percentile, where he has been charted since infancy, as showing food insecurity. Those are not clinical observations. Those are misrepresentations by a medical professional, and they align with the same clinical terminology used in the hotline complaints that your sister's vocabulary conveniently matches. Gerald put a hand on Connie's arm. It was the universal attorney gesture for stop talking. It was the kind of turn that happens when an attorney learns something about his client that his client did not share during the initial consultation. Connie was no longer smiling. She was looking at the table, not at me, not at the judge, at the wood, as if there were an answer somewhere in the grain.
Diane Foster, the guardian ad litem, spoke for the first time. She'd been reading each document as Grace placed it, making notes in the margin of her legal pad. She said, calmly, "I've reviewed the children's medical and school records independently. I also conducted an in-home visit 2 weeks ago. I see no basis whatsoever for the allegations in these complaints. I would not recommend expanded visitation at this time. And I am concerned, professionally concerned, about the circumstances under which these complaints were generated." Connie's head came up. "I was trying to protect my grandchildren." "From what?" Judge Moreland asked. The question sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. And Connie didn't answer. Not because she couldn't think of something to say. Because the truth was that there was nothing to protect them from. There had never been anything to protect them from. There was only a woman who'd lost her husband and was terrified of losing access to the only part of her life that still felt alive. And instead of saying that, instead of saying, "I'm lonely, I miss them, I'm afraid of being invisible," she built a legal weapon out of the system designed to protect her grandchildren and aimed it at their mother. Patrice wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. Her clinical language was on the page. Her handwritten notes were in the file. She would later tell Kyle, in a phone call he relayed to me, that she didn't realize it had gone that far. She realized. She just didn't expect the paperwork to come back stamped with her vocabulary. Judge Moreland denied the expanded visitation petition. He referred the complaint filings to DCS for review. He recommended that any future visitation be arranged through mediation with both attorneys present. And he said, looking directly at Connie, "The Department of Children's Services exists to protect children. It is not a strategic tool for family litigation. I take the misuse of that system seriously." Grace closed her folder. One folder, 7 documents, 4 months of my life reduced to 12 minutes of presentation, and one phrase that someone should never have studied. The fallout was specific. DCS opened a formal review of the 3 complaint filings. Patrice was interviewed by an investigator from an adjacent county, not David, someone without prior contact, to avoid conflict of interest. Her handwritten medical observations were compared against the children's actual pediatric records. The discrepancies were documented in clinical detail. Patrice was not criminally charged, but she was reported to the Tennessee Board of Nursing for misrepresenting clinical observations in connection with a legal proceeding. That review, as of today, is still pending. Linda Fry, the neighbor Connie recruited, came to my front door 3 weeks after the hearing. She was crying before I opened the screen. She said she had no idea what Connie was actually doing with the time she'd reported. She said she thought she was watching out for the kids. I believed her, because I've spent 7 years distinguishing between someone who was manipulated and someone who participated. And Linda had every marker of a woman who just realized she was a tool in someone else's toolbox. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her to be careful about who asks you to watch other people's families. I told her she was welcome for coffee anytime. She hasn't come over yet. That's okay. Some doors take time to walk back through. Kyle and Connie's relationship is a conversation that's still happening. I didn't ask him to choose between his wife and his mother. I showed him the timeline. I showed him the attorney's notes. I showed him the SDM phrase. And I let him sit with it. He sat with it for 2 weeks. The kind of 2 weeks where someone goes quiet at dinner and watches the kids play in the yard, with a look on his face that tells you he's replaying every conversation he had with his mother during those 5 months. Every time Connie called and said she was worried. Every time she suggested the kids seemed off. Every time she planted a seed of doubt about me that Kyle, to his credit, didn't water, but also didn't pool. Then he drove to Maryville alone and came back 3 hours later looking like a man who'd had the conversation he'd been building toward since January. I didn't ask what was said. Some conversations between a son and his mother aren't mine to audit, and some things a husband processes are his to carry. What I know is this: Connie's visits are now supervised, by mutual agreement.
and she has not filed anything since. Kyle did say one thing to me that night. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I said, "You weren't trained to see it. I was. That's not your fault." He said, "It's a little bit my fault." And I let him have that, because sometimes people need to own a piece of what happened in order to move past it. And that's not something I learned at DCS. That's something I learned from being married to a decent man who wanted to be better. 3 weeks after the hearing, Connie showed up at my front door. No casserole, no Pyrex, just herself, in a coat she'd buttoned wrong, standing on the same porch where I'd heard her on the phone 5 months earlier. She looked smaller. Not physically. The performance was gone. The smile was gone. The cardigan was the same, but the posture underneath it was different. Like a building that still has its facade, but the scaffolding has come out. She said, "I wasn't trying to take them." I said, "Connie, come in." She sat at my kitchen table. I did not offer coffee. Some moments don't get softened with caffeine. She said she missed them. She said after Frank died, the kids were the only part of her life that still moved forward. Everything else, the house, the neighborhood, the days, felt like they were standing still. And the only hours that had any momentum were the hours she spent with Nora and Emmett. She said she was afraid I was pulling them further away. She said she didn't know how to ask for more time without sounding like the kind of woman who makes demands. I let her finish. Every word. Then I said, and I want to be exact here, because I've said these words in my head so many times they've worn a groove. "Connie, I would have given you more time with them. I would have driven them to Maryville every other weekend. I would have done holidays at your house until they were old enough to choose. All you ever had to do was ask me. Instead, you tried to get me labeled as an unfit mother. You studied the system I spent 7 years serving, and you used it to make me look like the people I used to investigate. You didn't just try to take my children. You tried to take my identity. You tried to turn the thing I'm best at into the thing that condemned me. And that is something I need time to come back from." She cried. I did not comfort her. Not because I'm cruel. Because comfort in that moment would have told her it was okay. And it wasn't okay. And the kindest thing I could give her was the truth without the cushion. She left. I sat in my kitchen alone. The house was quiet except for Emmett's white noise machine humming through the baby monitor. I thought about the 900 homes I'd walked into. I thought about every parent who sat across from me and wondered if I could see the truth. I could. I always could. And this time, the truth was sitting at my own table. That was 8 months ago. Nora is 7 now. She lost a tooth last Tuesday and put it under her pillow in a Ziploc bag because she told me the tooth fairy probably has hygiene standards. I don't know where she got that. Joss swears it wasn't her. I have my suspicions. Emmett is still in the 30th percentile, still territorial about yogurt, still cries when he leaves anywhere with good snacks. His preschool teacher wrote on his spring assessment, "Emmett has excellent social skills and a strong sense of fairness," which is a professional way of saying he told another kid, "That's not your turn and you know it." My fridge is still full. I still photograph it on Sundays. Old habits. But now when I open the camera, I don't think about evidence. I think about what to make for dinner. That shift, from documentation to dinner planning, is the whole victory, even if it doesn't sound like one. Joss came over last Saturday, sat on my kitchen counter, still hasn't used a chair in her own home or anyone else's since 2016, and told me she'd been offered a position at a new pediatric clinic, with better hours and a covered parking spot. "I negotiated the parking spot separately," she said. "It's covered. Heated in winter. I would like credit for this accomplishment. You have my full professional admiration." That's all I've ever wanted, Ren. That and covered parking. She asked me if I thought about going back to DCS. I said no. She asked why. I said because the nonprofit lets me help families before they end up in the system. And after sitting on the other side of the intake form, I understand what prevention means in a way I didn't before. I'm not a different person. I'm the same investigator with the same eye for detail and the same instinct for patterns. I just finally know what the families felt when I knocked. Every single one of them. The ones who were guilty, and the ones who were innocent, and the ones who were just scared. I know now, in my body, what that knock costs. And that makes me better at helping families avoid hearing it. Last month, a client at the nonprofit, a young mother, 24, first kid, told me she was afraid someone was going to call CPS on her because her ex-boyfriend kept threatening to. She was shaking. I sat across from her and said, "Let me tell you what that process looks like. And let me tell you how to protect yourself." I walked her through documentation. I helped her photograph her home. I connected her with a family law attorney. And when she asked me how I knew so much about the system, I said, "I used to work in it. And then someone used it on me." She looked at me like I'd handed her something. I think what I handed her was the knowledge that she wasn't the only one. That's worth more than any casserole. I drive past the Knox County Courthouse sometimes on my way to Della's house. I see the building where she worked for 31 years. She called me the night after the hearing. Didn't ask for details, just said, "You read the complaint." I read the complaint, Della. And what did it tell you? What she wanted? And what did you want? I thought about it. My kids, my house, my name back. Then you got what you wanted, and you got it the right way, with paperwork. I'm holding her keychain right now. Brass key fob. Knox County Clerk of Court. 9 years on my car keys, and it's lost most of its shine. Which honestly makes it a more accurate representation of the family court system than when it was new. Della taught me to read the paperwork before I read the person. She taught me to keep an account that nobody else manages. She taught me that the system works when people use it honestly. What I learned on my own, what the last 8 months taught me that 7 years and 900 front doors didn't, is simpler than all of that. Knowing how the system works doesn't protect you from the system. It just means that when someone points it at you, you recognize the weapon. And you know, down to the paragraph and the phrase, how to take it apart. If this story hit you somewhere, if you've ever been the name on a form, or the woman on the porch hearing something she can't unhear, or the mother cleaning her house like evidence instead of like home, I'm glad you stayed. Like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.